Hello, my name is Levi Chekas. Today I'll be presenting about the civilization of the poor, a concept from liberation theology, and its relationship to AI. To begin with, let's talk about the social Christianity and its relationship to the civilization of poverty. Walter Rauschenbusch, a radical opponent of early 20th century Western civilization, used the term kingdom of evil to contrast the Christian kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven that Jesus had promised. Rauschenbusch's kingdom of evil exists as sort of a mirror image of the kingdom of God. Instead of blessed are the meek, it's blessed are the militant. Instead of blessed are the humble, it's blessed are the greedy. Capitalism, militarism, nationalism, racism are only a handful of vices the kingdom of evil lifts up over God's promises of free distribution, peace, and global solidarity. Rauschenbusch's ideas become further developed over the course of the 20th century, with some of his most potent development occurring in liberation theologies. Latin American liberation theology in the 60s and 70s took the idea of evil permeating our society and articulated this as structural evils, or more commonly in Catholic theology today, social sins. The idea of a social sin is a peculiar notion. The traditional notion of sin in Catholicism relies on individual committed acts. Though Catholicism has a long emphasized role of communities in shaping character, as theologian John Mahoney points out, the breadth of Catholic moral theology has emphasized catalogs of individual acts over other moral actions or moral visions. Thus, to refer to a social sin is a misnomer. The evils rampant in various structures, beliefs, institutions, laws, or policies in our society do not fit into clear categories of guilt or responsibility. Who is responsible, for example, for the so-called glass ceiling? Are all culpable for exploitative labor practices in other countries, or is it just one person? The concept of social sin has, unsurprisingly, parallels in other areas. In the much controverted critical race theory discussions across the United States today, the question of whether systemic racism actually exists is once again on trial. Despite all evidence at hand, including most obviously higher mortality rates among populations of color during the COVID pandemic and the uptick of anti-Asian hate crimes, mostly white conservatives in the United States and elsewhere continue to insist that the everyday experiences of racism that people like James Baldwin and Frantz Fanon brilliantly articulated more than 60 years ago are mere fantasy. From a theological perspective, this resistance is understandable. A kingdom of evil, and one tendency of the kingdom of evil is its insistence to its citizens that it is in fact a paradise. Key to liberation theologians' critique of sinfulness of industrialized civilizations is the unconscionable gulf between wealthy nations and poor former colonies. With prophetic incisiveness, these theologians articulated a principle in the 1968 Episcopal Conference of Latin American Bishops in Medellin, Colombia, namely the option for the poor. The option for the poor echoes the reversal of fortunes Mary sings of in her Magnificat in Luke 1, verses 46 to 55. Latin American theologians argued not only for the increase of charity to the poor, but for an accounting of the injustices of poverty and a priority of the voices and needs of the poor over the privilege and pride of the wealthy. Pope Francis himself was shaped in this theological context, as is evidenced by his call for a poor church today and his actions to direct Vatican material resources to the needs of Rome's homeless and housed poor. The theologian Ignacio Echavarria, a martyr of the Salvadoran Civil War, took this a step further. Echavarria, following the two kingdoms model of Rauschenbusch, contrasted the civilization with a civilization of poverty with the civilization of wealth. The civilization of wealth was the model of first world capitalism. Dignity is tied to material success, survival is left to the cold mechanisms of the market, and most importantly, progress and innovation are the major aims. Thus, capitalists excuse any amount of suffering present under the insatiable criterion of technological progress. The civilization of poverty, on the other hand, prioritizes social cooperation, distribution of goods, and universal dignity and human rights. This civilization may not put men on the moon or internet in every home, but it will not justify global conflict, environmental depletion, and sweatshop labor to put smartphones in our hands. Moving on to this in relation to AI and the civilization of wealth. Artificial intelligence fits neatly within the model of civilization of wealth. Artificial intelligence, of course, means many different things to many different people. From the earliest visions of Turing and McCarthy, AI has meant mostly human level cognition and calculating machines. Today, however, AI is a $300 billion industry, which forecasters hope will continue to grow. AI today offers many promises, such as improved medical diagnostics, labor automation, greater wealth augmentation through automated trading, safer driving conditions, better science, better governance, better war fighting, better legal prosecution, better sales, better medicine. Every major application of AI is either really or expected to be an improvement upon current and future conditions. The promised achievement, to no surprise, based on the high cost of the technology, is better results, whatever the field. This, I think, is a surprise to nobody living in a late stage capitalistic world. It does open the question of really what the good of AI is. Is it merely just augmenting current systems? The vision of early AI theorists and even the motivation of many leading researchers today is general AI, AI that replicates human cognition. Many discussions in AI ethics muse about the morality of such an action. Would we be able to submit a conscious computer to the same tasks we submit our current programs to? Anthony Lewandowski, an industrial spy whom former President Trump gave pardon to in his last days, created a church of AI, believing eventually AI will become God to us. The promise of AI, as in the claims of Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil, is the next step in evolution. Therefore, and this idea has attracted passionate AI researchers since the 1960s, but the promise of what AI can do is what, for capital, is what has sustained the field. Now, I must therefore be couched within this narrative. The aspirations of general AI assume that technology and science must be funded sufficiently to create artificial life. Kurzweil sees this as inevitable. Many transhumanists see this as a moral imperative. But even AI researchers not enthralled by science fiction promises of machine brains still pursue a narrowly material concept of progress, even if they are not unapologetic capitalists, and they pursue the aims of material progress. The promise of AI is ultimately to reduce human labor, to maximize output, to perfect human actions. At present, AI pursuits are subject to the aims of funders, all of whom, according to market logic, want a maximal return on investment. This is clearly true for private investors or corporate investors who hope to achieve some specific goals, such as reducing labor costs, improving economic forecasting, or creating superior products. This is no less true for government investors like DARPA or the National Science Foundation, who seek specific aims with their funding as well. Actor network theory has long demonstrated the truth that pure science or technology, even something like Google's DeepMind project or the Machine Intelligence Research Institute's aims at general AI, are subject to funding insofar as they are able to sufficiently enroll other interested actors. Marx is vindicated then as we note that material conditions set the tone of this technology. There is no value neutral AI then. There is no economically neutral AI either. Even a quick glance at the EU-sponsored AI projects demonstrates this. Pantheon hopes to massively organize agriculture. Second Hands will save labor costs in the health services section. SafeLog saves labor in the warehouse. Hephaestus saves labor in building constructions. Fabulos streamlines factory processes. Even a project like CyberLegs, which is directed toward adaptive leg prostheses, is focused on evaluating costs of the technology and the best way to save money. In short, AI is a suite of technologies from natural language processing to visual recognition. The goal of general AI is rooted in the civilization of wealth. At its best, AI will improve efficiency across society and help those worst off in the most efficient means possible. At its worst, however, AI will further increase the power and wealth of those already wielding these, the US Departments of Defense and Justice, people like Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Musk, and others like them, Goldman Sachs, Bridgewater Associates, Bain Capital, and other investing firms, Amazon, Nestle, Bayer, and other companies, multinational corporations, governments across the world, et cetera, et cetera. AI is oriented and situated within a world directed toward techno-progressive future. The world AI is bringing forth is one where the answers to everything beyond their already inestimable to everything is answerable by machine. This means that those already benefiting from industrialism will rise beyond their already inestimable world prominence. More significant for my own work, this also means that the problems of global poverty will be, as they have for centuries now, reduced to mere problems of allocations of resources. AIs run by NGOs and governmental agencies will be directed in their best case scenario to providing resources to the poor according to the evaluative measures of machines programmed by those in power. We can therefore consider AI within the terms of Sheila Jasnoff's notion of a socio-technical imaginary. As technology simultaneously reflects our current values and proposes a vision of the future which we strive for. Values embedded in AI are values of efficiency. Ironically, the vision of Adam Smith was 2 centuries ago before the vision of Turing. Everything can be reduced to questions of algorithmic decision-making, just as an unregulated market will flourish on its own due to the invisible hand of rational self-interest. The vision it proposes specifically is one where all questions of beauty, truth, justice, and even, as evidenced by general AI, wisdom, are resolved through efficient machine reasoning. We're able to make a machine that will do all things for all people. This is the vision of AI. It's a vision that people are attracted to and are working toward. Liberation theology, on the other hand, unmasks this vision as merely an instantiation of the civilization of wealth, and a bad one at that. The vision of rational self-interest or profit maximization or energy efficiency is a desire of those afraid to lose control of these things. The poor, so Ea Correa and his student John Sobrino note, are less interested in these things. Eking out a survival is more important than maximizing profit. Connecting with and providing for our neighbors as humans is more important than merely automatically distributing goods. Being part of a community, irreducible to the sum of its parts, requires us to have other goals and values beyond efficiency. Lifting up human rights, even when costly, must be prioritized. Most of all, human lives cannot be taken for granted. That we live is a miracle, and that we survive is a holy and terrible mystery, not a given. So what does the option of the poor say for AI? Civilization of the poor, writes Ea Correa, quote, rejects the accumulation of capital as the engine of history and the possession and enjoyment of wealth as the principle of humanization. Rather, it makes the universal satisfaction of basic needs the principle of development and the growth of shared solidarity the basis of humanization, unquote. Such a civilization rests on what is sometimes called the option for the poor, a term liberation theologians use to contrast to the regnant option for the rich, or the option for the powerful. This exists as an orientation. The reversal, Nietzsche himself rages against in Genealogy of Morals, which is morally most important, as Jesus notes in the Sermon on, what is morally most important, as Jesus notes in the Sermon on the Mount, are those most often trampled or ignored by the mighty. Additionally, the option for the poor is seen primarily as a moral imperative. Catholic theology has long maintained the moral duty of support for the poor. From the early church fathers like St. Basil, who said, quote, the bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry, unquote, to St. Thomas Aquinas, who cites Basil's contemporary and friend Ambrose of Milan to justify the poor stealing from the rich, to modern Catholic social teaching, which advocates for governments to redistribute wealth to protect the poor. It is the mainstay of Catholic teaching that the poor do not exist in relation to the rich in a merely supererogatory function, but that justice itself demands the largesse of the rich be used to help the poor. Liberation theology, however, takes this a step further. Aside from making poverty the central moral concern against which all other moral concerns must become derivative, they prioritize the experience of the poor. John Sobrino writes that in the poor, quote, the mystery of reality breaks through, erupts, and in them the very reality of God breaks through, unquote. Thus, aside from charity or even the demand of justice, the claim of liberation theologians is that the poor occupy an epistemological primacy. One can really only know reality and the mysterium fidei, the mystery of faith, through the witness of the poor. The problem of AI's socio-technical vision is thus quite obvious. Far from privileging the perspective of the poor, AI reinscribes the epistemological assumptions of the wealthy. The goals of AI are the goals of the civilization of wealth. AI is designed to increase wealth and possession for those who wield it. Even in human AI projects, efficiency is the key metric for AI funding. What will not yield better outcomes for healthcare systems or state bureaus or charitable giving is not worth investing in. In the end, what AI researchers aim for is a society where wealth is even more enlarged, where those who have power now may have even greater power. Even when their work is directed toward noble aims, the aims are all reducible to the logic of capital. At its present state, AI will never be directed to the option for the poor. But one problem presents itself, which I think AI opens a new possibility for. As someone who grew up in first world poverty, I've always found liberation theologians to be a bit insufferable, even though I like them. Sobrino writes of how the poor save the rest of us, how they give more to the rest of us. Even if this is true, it lends itself to a grotesque justification of the deeply evil systems at play. It makes it seem like the poor are better off somehow. What's worse, the option for the poor is co-opted into slogans like being voices for the voiceless, a sentimental but clear shuddering of Gayatri Spivak's provocative question, can the subaltern speak? In the end, the viewpoint of mostly bourgeois, often Spanish, ordained priests living in and writing in Latin America, even in their best intentions, betrays perspectives which can never fully represent the voices of the poor. Even if liberation theology is a dominant theological framework, the option for the poor as an epistemological framework is still absent. Until the poor can speak for themselves, we cannot truly hear them. And that's quite unlikely as long as theology and other disciplines tend to be dominated by bourgeois thinkers. Here is where AI can redeem itself. Since AI is essentially a question of programmed algorithms and data sets, it is not impossible to have an AI that embodies the values and epistemologies of the poor instead of the rich. One simple way to do this is to use data sets determined by and consisting of information given by the poor. This could be done through any of the ordinary data collecting methods that we typically use: photography, text creation, sound bites, tests, created sample sets, or the like. Natural language processing unit that has held conversation with Honduran peasants or Chinese factory workers, Indian untouchables, or American homeless will have different linguistic references and conversational understandings than those trained by tech bros in Silicon Valley. A second option, though, more difficult, but I think ultimately better, would be to empower the poor to code their own AI programs. Instead of being built to meet the expectations set by those in powerful, such as facial recognition for advertising or law enforcement, the poor might create AI with very different aims, such as an AI that monitors and predicts police activity, or one that helps people better access funds, or perhaps more importantly, even useless AIs whose function achieves nothing clearly of instrumental value. AI represents increasingly the horizon of human cognition. The pursuit of AIs that are better than we are and the goal of general AI both reinforce the idea that ultimately the hegemonic capitalist mindset of efficiency and rationalism is the best option for our future. The option for the poor negates this position, demanding that the all-encompassing pursuit of capital be subjected to the greater vision of the universal human solidarity. On this front, AI at present seems to fail, but in its theoretical orientation, it might be redirected to a new futural vision, one that prioritizes the poor, giving them a true voice and a more privileged place within our world. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you in our session.